Hello again, and welcome to another podcast from Duncan Cartlidge Online. May I take this opportunity to wish you a happy and prosperous new year, and thank you for your support during the past 12 months. As usual, Barney is here, and he sends his best wishes too for 2024. Incidentally, I've just finished work on the third edition of the Estimator's Pocketbook, which is now in production and should be available in mid-2024. As well as the paperback and the Kindle editions, there will also be an eBook Plus version that contains lots of hyperlinks, definitions, spreadsheets, audio and video links, and quizzes. Not sure of the price yet. I'll let you know near the launch date, but it may be worth a look. In this episode, we'll have a look at extensions of time. Do they give an automatic right for a claim for loss and expense? Soft landings, why the slow uptake, and valuing variations. So let's start off looking at extensions of time. You know, I've always thought the mechanisms for determining the length of the contract period as somewhat subjective. As a young QS, I remember well pre-contract meetings where my elders and betters gave their opinions as to how long the contract should take. 24 months, 30 months? I tell you what, let's settle on 27. Rather like throwing a piece of seaweed out of the window to see if it's going to rain. Which is surprising really, as having a realistic contract period has a major influence on the financial success of a project for a contractor. I recall the RRCS and the University of Salford produced an expert system in the 1980s to try to inject a little more science into the calculation, but I don't think it added very much to the process. Anyway, a contract period is agreed and inserted into the contract particulars. The contract is signed, but as we all know, delays to the contract period is the commonest and most costly problem in projects. In relation to completion, JCT 16 uses the term practical completion as it has been recognised by the courts that it is virtually impossible to finish every part of a complex building project by the agreed completion date, and although not 100% complete, the client is able to take possession and use the building. Nevertheless, if the contractor fails to finish on time, as stated in the contract particulars, then damages are due. However, because of the difficulty in assessing the level of damages, JCT allows for liquidated and ascertained damages, or as they're sometimes called LADs, to be applied, usually in terms of an amount of money per week inserted into the contract particulars. The advantages of LADs is that they let the contractor know in advance their liability to the employer for late completion, and this can be taken into account in any risk assessment when deciding whether to tender for the job. For the employer, LADs provide the security of receiving immediate compensation in the event of a delay, and no loss needs to be demonstrated. When it comes to assessing the level of damages, however, LADs must be a genuine pre-estimate of loss suffered by the client, as courts will not enforce what is thought to be a disproportionate sum, as this will be regarded as a penalty. Of course, there are many valid reasons why a contractor is unable to finish by the agreed completion date, and the imposition of LADs for events outside the contractor's control would be unfair. JCT 16 allows the contract administrator to grant an extension of time to the contract period, provided that certain criteria are met, and these will be discussed in a minute. It is important to note that the contractor should inform the contract administrator as soon as the delay becomes apparent, and continue to try to mitigate the delay and not just sit back. One of the main misconceptions of contractors and subcontractors is that an extension of time gives them an automatic right to claim for loss and expense. That is not the case. The granting of an extension of time simply relieves the contractor from having to pay LADs. Any loss and expense must be approved with a separate and fully substantiated claim, if applicable. For an extension of time to be granted when using JCT 16, certain criteria must be followed. Importantly, any application for an extension of time must be related to a relevant event, as set out in the JCT 16. Clause 2.29 lists 15 examples of relevant events, of which number 15, force majeure, has proved to be the most contentious. The literal translation of force majeure is act of God, and lawyers have spent an awfully long time and earned an awful lot of money trying to establish whether an act of God, namely, and I quote, a circumstance which no human foresight can provide against, and of which human prudence is not bound to recognise the possibility, had occurred. In the event of force majeure being established as the cause of delay, then the parties call it quits. Neither party will have a financial claim against the other. Each party will bear their own costs, and the contract remains in force, as all do the obligations. Finally, before we leave extensions of time, some important JCT 16 housekeeping. Applications for extension of time must be in writing and should contain an estimate of delay, and this process should be repeated for each delay. Along with the application, contractors are also required to submit details to substantiate the estimate. After submission of the application, the contract administrator has up to 12 weeks to decide the outcome, although it should be sorted out as soon as practical. So let's have a look at soft landings. Many people think, and I'm one of them, that the introduction of soft landings was overshadowed by the silver bullet hype surrounding BIM, which is a great pity, as soft landings has a lot to offer the construction client. As buildings become more complicated and technologically reliant, the need for soft landings has never been more important, as many designers do not take sufficient account of how occupiers will manage and use completed buildings. Soft landings and government soft landings refer to a strategy designed to make an easy transition from the construction to the occupation phases of a project, with the overriding aim of realizing optimal operational performance. So, instead of the client experiencing a hard landing and being handed the keys and told to get on with it, guidance is available to get the best out of the completed building for the first 3 years. Soft landings was launched in 2009 by the Building Services Research and Information Association and then updated in 2014. Government soft landings were introduced in 2016. I think one of the reasons why soft landings adoption has stalled is that very little about the process is available open access. Of course, soft landings come with a price tag, and in some respects, trying to sell soft landings to clients is like trying to move the focus away from bottom-line capital costs to whole-life costs. In other words, convincing people that by spending an extra £1 a day, you could save spending an additional £3 in the future. Anecdotal estimates of the contribution that government soft landings can achieve in terms of annual energy savings are up to £350,000 per annum on a large secondary school. To be effective, soft landings require the design and the construction teams to remain involved after practical completion, and, as with other techniques such as value engineering and lifecycle costs, soft landings should be introduced into the design sequence as early as possible, and in addition, the client should nominate a soft landings champion. Soft landings and government soft landings are aligned, except that the government soft landings are more a set of facilities management driven requirements. In addition, government soft landings include a mechanism for monitoring costs. Now let's have a look at valuing variations. Once a contract is concluded, the terms can't be changed unless the parties make a further valid agreement for alteration or the contract contains provision for variations. For this reason, most standard forms of contract have extensive mechanisms for permitting change and variations. Changes generally fall into two categories: changes or substitutions of work or materials, and changes to the obligations and restrictions put on the contractor. Although the power of the contract administrator is wide under the forms of contract, there are limits. For example, if a power-crazed contract administrator issued so many variations that the scope of the works are changed, this is not permitted. Generally, variations should be in writing, although they may be issued in a number of formats, for example, a revised drawing or a letter or a request by the contractor. So it's best to keep an eye open and compile a change order register as soon as possible, because when it comes to the final account, if a change doesn't have the required authorization, it won't be paid. And another tip, don't leave the measurement and pricing of variations until the final account. Deal with them while the work is fresh in everyone's mind. So, assuming all the boxes have been ticked, how are approved variations valued? The widely accepted view for traditionally procured contracts is: if the work that is subject to the variation is the same as the original scheme, then bill or schedule rates should be used, and clearly these rates can be used to value emissions. In the second scenario, if the work is similar to the original, then rates based on the original rates should be calculated by using pro rata or proportional pricing. As with approximate quantities, there are several approaches to doing this. The technique of pro rata pricing involves disassembling a bill rate and submitting new data in order to calculate a new rate that can be used for pricing variations. If too many of the elements that constitute a rate have to be adjusted, then it's better to build up a new rate from basic principles as described next. If there is no comparable work in the original pricing, then an agreed rate or reasonable rate can be used, building up rates from first principles, the so-called star rates. When I enter a star rate into the variation account, I enter it in red and highlight it with, believe it or not, a star. In the case of both pro rata pricing and star rates, a record should be kept of the calculations and the build-up. The nuclear option. If all of the above fails to come up with a fair price, then turn to the dreaded dayworks. Dayworks, loved by contractors and hated by clients' quantity surveyors. But what are dayworks? Dayworks comprise two parts: the so-called prime cost or basic cost of labour, plant and materials, defined by the RICS, although note other definitions are available. To the basic cost is added a percentage, inserted into the tender documents by the contractor and which forms part of the bid. Work that is carried out on a daywork basis should have the materials, plant and labour recorded on a daywork sheet and submitted to the contract administrator or clerk of works not later than 7 days after the work has been executed. These sheets are usually signed for record purposes only and passed over to the QS to sort out. Dayworks invariably come up with a higher rate than bill rates, which is why some contractors will record all variation work on daywork sheets in the hope that daywork rates will be applied. Away from these fun and games, there are genuine instances where daywork rates are, in my opinion, fair and reasonable, and these are typically circumstances where work has to be carried out in small quantities or out of sequence with the rest of the works. In practice, valuing changes in quantity or quality of work rarely poses problems. However, disputes can occur over the disruptive effect caused by variations. And finally, it should be noted that the following are treated under JCT 16 as if they are variations, They are in effect automatic variations. These are errors in the bills of quantities, compliance with statutory requirements, restoration of work after damage by fire, and protective work, etc. on the outbreak of hostilities, and finally changes in quantity. While we're talking about changes in quantity, it is widely accepted that if there is a significant variation to the quantity of work, a fair price should be agreed. However, what does significant change mean? You'll not be surprised to know that there's no hard and fast rule for determining this, although NRM2 does suggest that 20% should be the point at which changes in quantities are significant and new rates should be negotiated. Well, that's all for now. Thanks for listening, and from Barney and me, bye for now.